None of them are yours. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. The doctor didn't even flinch as he said it, his face a perfect mask of professionalism, as though he'd just informed me about a common flu. But the impact was devastating. I felt the world tilt under my feet, like the floor was giving way beneath me, like reality itself had twisted into some unrecognizable nightmare. I blinked, trying to comprehend what he had just told me. None of them. How could that be? Excuse me? My voice sounded foreign, hollow. There was no way I had heard him right. Can you repeat that? The doctor glanced at his computer screen again, as if it could somehow change the results he'd just given me. His eyes finally met mine, and I saw a flicker of something, pity maybe, but it didn't last long. I'm sorry, Mr. Cole, but according to the DNA test results, none of the children share your genetic markers. They aren't biologically yours. I felt a searing heat rising in my chest. My mind flashed to my wife, Sarah, and our three beautiful children. Sophia, who just turned 10, Owen at 8, and little Emma, barely 5 years old. For a decade, I had been a father to those kids. I had held them in my arms, kissed their scraped knees, tucked them in at night, and read them stories. For a decade, I had lived in the blissful belief that they were mine. And now, none of them? I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor with a jarring screech. This has to be a mistake, I said, my voice shaking. Are you sure you did the test right? This is impossible. The doctor remained calm, as if he'd seen men like me in this position 100 times before. Maybe he had, but it didn't help. I was drowning in a sea of confusion and betrayal. The results are conclusive, he said gently. If you'd like, we can conduct a second test, but it's very unlikely the results will change. My mind raced. The doctor's office suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. I needed to get out of there. I needed to breathe. The room felt like a cage, and I couldn't stand it anymore. I stormed out, ignoring the receptionist's concerned glance. My hands were trembling as I fumbled with my car keys. When I finally got inside the car, I slammed the door shut and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. How? How had this happened? The memory of Sarah's smile flashed through my mind. Her soft laugh, the way she'd run her fingers through her hair when she was nervous. We'd been together for over 15 years, since college. She was the love of my life, the mother of my children. How could she have lied to me for so long? How could she have betrayed me on such a massive scale? The betrayal cut deeper than I could have ever imagined. The thought of confronting her, of hearing her side of the story, made my stomach churn. But I had to know. I had to face her. There was no running away from this. The children were at school. It was just her at home. I drove like a man possessed, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were shaking even worse than before. I barely registered the fact that I was gripping the door handle too tightly as I walked into the house. The sound of the front door opening seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. I found Sarah in the kitchen, her back to me as she chopped vegetables for dinner, like it was any other day. "Sarah?" I said, my voice tight. She turned around, her face lighting up with a smile that immediately disappeared when she saw my expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting the knife down. Her brow furrowed with concern, but I saw something else flicker in her eyes: guilt. "You tell me," I said, my voice cold. "Who are they?" Sarah blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" I threw the envelope containing the DNA results on the kitchen counter. She looked at it, and her face drained of color. Her hand went to her mouth as if she could physically stop the truth from spilling out. But I already knew. The results didn't lie. "You've been lying to me," I said, each word sharp with anger. "For years. These kids, they're not mine. None of them." Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "Please, let me explain." "Explain?" I nearly laughed, but it came out as more of a snarl. "You've been cheating on me, Sarah, For how long? How many men? She winced as if I'd struck her. It's not like that, Daniel. Please. Then what is it like? I shouted, unable to control myself. I've been raising kids that aren't mine. Do you have any idea what you've done? Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move me. Not this time. I was too far gone, too hurt, too angry. I didn't want her tears. I wanted the truth. Sarah collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs, but I couldn't find any sympathy for her. How could I? The woman I had loved, trusted, and built a life with had shattered my world. I never meant for it to happen like this, she whispered through her tears. Like what? I shot back. You never meant for me to find out? No, she said, shaking her head. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for things to go this far. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I had heard excuses before, but this was beyond anything I could have ever imagined. So how long, Sarah? How long have you been lying to me? Her sobs quieted, and she looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. It wasn't like I was cheating the whole time. I glared at her, waiting for an answer. Every second of silence felt like another knife twisting in my back. She swallowed hard. It started after Sophia was born, she admitted. You were working so much, and I felt so alone. Don't you dare put this on me, I said, my voice shaking with fury. Don't you dare act like this was my fault. She nodded quickly, as if trying to appease me. I know, I'm not blaming you. I'm just trying to explain. It wasn't about love. I didn't love them. It was a mistake, Daniel. A horrible, stupid mistake. And yet it happened 3 times, I said bitterly, my voice dripping with sarcasm. 3 mistakes that just happened to result in 3 children. Sarah's lips trembled as she tried to form words. I could see the panic rising in her eyes. She knew there was no way out of this, no excuse that could fix the damage she had caused. And still, she tried. It's not what you think, she said desperately. Yes, I made mistakes, but they're still your kids. You've raised them, loved them. Blood doesn't change that, does it? Her words struck me like a slap to the face. I had raised those kids. I had loved them. But everything was different now. How could I look at them the same way knowing they weren't mine? Every smile, every hug, every proud moment, it all felt tainted now, poisoned by the truth. How many men? I asked again, my voice low and dangerous. I needed to know the full scope of her betrayal. I needed to understand just how deep her deception ran. Sarah looked away, biting her lip. It was only one, she whispered. One man. One man had fathered all 3 of her children. The thought made me sick. Who is he? I demanded. I deserve to know. She hesitated, and for a brief moment I thought she wasn't going to answer. But then she sighed, as if resigning herself to the inevitable. His name is David, she said quietly. David Hartman. The name hit me like a freight train. David. Of all the people it could have been, David. He was one of my oldest friends. We had known each other since college, even before Sarah came into the picture. He was practically family. He had been there when I proposed to her. He had been there when each of the kids was born. I felt the room spin, my vision blurring with a mix of rage and disbelief. My wife. My best friend. All this time? I'm sorry, Sarah said again, her voice barely a whisper. But her apology meant nothing. Not now. Not after this. I turned on my heel and walked out, ignoring her desperate pleas. This wasn't something I could just forgive. This wasn't something I could ever forget. I needed answers. I needed justice. And I would get it, one way or another. The drive to David Hartman's house was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight that I could barely feel my fingers. My mind raced with images of him and Sarah, laughing, spending time together at family gatherings, celebrating birthdays. I could see it all now in a different light. All those moments weren't just innocent. They were laced with lies, betrayal, and deceit. How had I been so blind? How had I missed the signs? The house came into view, that modest two-story place in the quiet suburb where David had lived alone for years. The irony of it was bitter. He was a constant fixture in our lives. Yet somehow he had managed to stay in the background, never drawing suspicion. Until now. I parked the car and got out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. My heart pounded in my chest, each step toward his front door fueled by anger. I had no plan for what I was going to do once I saw him. All I knew was that I needed answers. I needed to look him in the eyes and demand the truth. I banged on the door, the sound echoing in the still evening air. A moment later, the door creaked open and there he was. David, my so-called best friend. He looked surprised to see me, but smiled anyway, as if nothing had changed. As if he hadn't stolen my entire life right from under my nose. "Daniel, hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe casually. "What's going on, man?" I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, staring at him, trying to find the right words. How do you even begin to confront someone who has taken everything from you? "Let me in," I said, my voice hard. David's brow furrowed, clearly sensing that something was wrong. "Is everything okay? You seem—" I said, "Let me in." My tone left no room for argument. He stepped aside, holding the door open as I stormed past him. I made my way into his living room, barely able to contain the rage building inside me. Every fiber of my being screamed to lash out. But I knew I needed answers first. David followed behind, his confusion growing with every step. "What's going on, Daniel? You're freaking me out." I spun around to face him. "You've been sleeping with my wife." His expression froze, the casual smile vanishing from his face as he paled. He didn't say a word, but his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Guilt, shock, the realization that his secret was out. "How long?" I demanded, stepping closer, my fists clenched at my sides. "How long have you been screwing her behind my back?" David swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Daniel, How long?" I repeated, my voice shaking with barely controlled fury. He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "It started about 9 years ago," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "after Sophia was born. 9 years of lies, 9 years of betrayal, 9 years of living in a delusion while the two people I trusted most stabbed me in the back. I couldn't hold back anymore. My fist flew through the air before I even realized what I was doing, connecting squarely with David's jaw. He stumbled backward, crashing into the coffee table and sending a lamp tumbling to the floor. "How could you do this to me?" I shouted, standing over him. "You were my best friend, David. You were there for everything, for my wedding, for my kids' births, and the whole time you were screwing my wife?" He groaned in pain, clutching his jaw as he struggled to sit up. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he gasped. It just did." I grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, hauling him to his feet. "That's your excuse? That's all you have to say?" His eyes were wide with fear, but he didn't fight back. He just stood there, his face twisted in regret and shame. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. It was a mistake, a stupid, horrible mistake." I released him, shoving him away in disgust. "A mistake? You think this is just a mistake? I've been raising your kids, David. Your kids. Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" He winced, the weight of my words crashing down on him. I know I've destroyed everything. I wish I could take it back, I swear. But you've been a father to them, Daniel. You're the one who's raised them." I shook my head, my heart breaking all over again. "Don't you dare try to justify this. I loved those kids because I thought they were mine. You took that from me. You took everything." David's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but I didn't care. I didn't want his apologies, his regret, his guilt. I wanted him to suffer the way I was suffering. I wanted him to feel the same gut-wrenching agony that had consumed me since the moment I learned the truth. "I trusted you," I said, my voice trembling. I let you into my life, my family, and you betrayed me. He hung his head, unable to meet my gaze. I know, and I'll never forgive myself for it. The silence between us was suffocating. For a moment, I wondered if I should hit him again, if it would make the pain go away. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Nothing would. I want you out of their lives, I said coldly. You don't deserve to be anywhere near them. David flinched, as if my words had physically hurt him. They're my kids, Daniel. They're my kids, I snapped, cutting him off. I don't care what the DNA says. You don't get to claim them now. You lost that right the second you started this affair. He nodded slowly, his face crumpling with defeat. If that's what you want, it is, I said firmly. And if I ever see you near them again, you'll wish I'd killed you tonight. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and left his house, slamming the door behind me. The days after my confrontation with David were a blur. I filed for divorce immediately. There was no question that my marriage with Sarah was over, but that wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed closure. I needed to make sure neither she nor David would ever walk away unscathed. That's when I decided to sue her for paternity fraud. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about justice. I had spent over a decade loving and supporting children I believed were mine, only to find out that my entire life had been built on a lie. Sarah had taken that from me, and I was going to make sure she paid for it. My lawyer, Mark, was quick to take the case. He had handled paternity fraud cases before, though he admitted none had been quite as emotionally charged as mine. We gathered all the evidence, the DNA tests, and the timeline of Sarah's affair with David, the financial records showing my contributions to the children's upbringing. Everything pointed to one undeniable conclusion. I had been deceived. I know this is going to be a tough fight, Mark warned me one afternoon as we prepared for court. Paternity fraud cases are complicated. Even though you weren't the biological father, you've been their legal father for years. The court might still rule that you're responsible for their well-being. I nodded, though the thought made me sick. I had been willing to care for those kids because I thought they were mine. But now, knowing the truth, I couldn't. I didn't know if I had it in me anymore. Do you think we can win? I asked quietly. Mark looked me in the eye, his expression serious. We have a strong case, but the courts are unpredictable. It's going to depend on how much the judge sympathizes with your situation. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with an unbearable tension. Sarah sat on one side, her face pale and drawn. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Across the aisle, David sat with his own legal team, his face grim. Neither of them spoke to me. The judge was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. As the case unfolded, I could see her studying all of us, weighing the evidence, trying to determine what kind of man I was and what kind of woman Sarah had been. My lawyer laid out everything. How Sarah had lied to me for years, how she had allowed me to believe the children were mine, how I had financially supported them without ever knowing the truth. He spoke about the emotional toll it had taken on me, how my entire world had been ripped apart. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she broke down in tears. She apologized over and over again, but I couldn't tell if her tears were for me or for herself. Her lawyer argued that I had been a father to those children for their entire lives, that blood didn't change that fact. They argued that removing me from their lives now would be more damaging to the kids than anything else. David didn't speak much. He mostly sat there, head bowed, as his lawyer argued that while he had made a mistake, he wasn't a bad person. He wanted to be a part of his children's lives now, even if it was late. The judge took several days to deliberate. They were the longest days of my life, filled with uncertainty and dread. When the final ruling came down, I wasn't sure what to expect. The judge ruled in my favor, partially. Sarah was found guilty of paternity fraud. I would no longer be responsible for the children financially, but I would have to remain in their lives if I chose. I had been their father for too long to simply walk away. The children had known no one else but me. As much as the truth had broken me, the judge believed that severing my relationship with them would do more harm than good. But David was given rights as well. He was granted limited custody, though the judge made it clear that he would have to prove himself before being granted more time with the kids. It wasn't the complete victory I had hoped for. I wasn't free from the pain, the betrayal, or the responsibility. But it was something. It was a step toward healing, even if it was a long road ahead. In the weeks that followed, I tried to adjust to my new reality. I still saw the kids, though it was harder now, knowing the truth. They didn't know the details yet. How could I tell them that the man they thought was their father wasn't? How could I explain that their mother had lied to us all? But I was still their dad. I still loved them, even if it was complicated. And one day, when they were old enough, I'd tell them the truth. Not the whole ugly story, but enough. Enough for them to understand why things had changed. As for Sarah, I couldn't forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I wasn't the same man I was before. I was stronger now, hardened by the betrayal, but not broken. David? I hadn't spoken to him since the trial. I didn't know if I ever would. Some wounds heal, some don't. But I was still standing, and that was enough.